Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charlie Barker. I'm glad you can hear my voice today because Friday you have a tough time hearing me. I'm the president of the Penfield Heritage Association, and I thank you all for coming this afternoon. We have a nice full house here, and everyone's aware there are refreshments in the back. Please help yourself to those. They are being provided by the library, and of course there's popcorn back here provided by our treasurer, Gene Casey. All right, well, I'm going to get started with introducing Donovan Shilling. He has a number of books he has written. Last year, around this time, he did a talk on the mills in the Penfield area and surrounding in Rochester, and it was quite well attended. And now he's back again today to do a talk on movie mania. And he has a book here that I've already had the privilege of perusing, and it is astonishing what he has gathered. And I'm not going to say anything more because he's the expert on it. So, Donovan, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Well, first of all, let me say that what I say is going to be spontaneous and unrehearsed, okay? It's not just a lecture. It's going to be me telling you a little bit about the book. And I'm trying to be modest, okay? All right, if I can. I come from a little background that has a little bit to do with the theater, because my father, back in the 1920s, and his grandfather, my grandfather, opened the Rivoli Theater on West Avenue in Fairport. And it was a silent film, and so I've always had a little inkling about what it must have been like. My father didn't tell much about it. He talked about Fatty Arbuckle and a few of those interesting people that lived back then, but not an awful lot. So I decided that it would be interesting to collect some of the reviews and some of the programs and some of the things that were a part of Rochester's history as far as the theater is concerned. And I found out there's an awful lot of it. So the book only weighs a half a pound, but it's got a lot of interesting things in it. And where possible, I decided to put them into color to make it more interesting for the reader. It's also very heavy reading, but it's okay because of the size of the book. So I guess we'll go back first and say this, that if you ask yourself, what is there about the movies that made them so popular? And the answer, of course, is that it was a way that departed from reality. You went into a path that took you down the green road or the road to Rio or over the rainbow. And when you did that, you were in a different world. And for a lot of people, particularly during that part that we call the Depression, of course, none of you people are old enough to remember it, but if there were somebody here, you remember those years. And this took you away from those days that were so difficult and so on. You got into realms of romance. You got into things that were mysteries. You had musicals. You had comedy. You had all kinds of epic adventures. And it was just a great place to get away. And didn't cost a lot of money. As a matter of fact, it was so much better than the very first motion pictures around Rochester. Now, what were they? I thought you'd never ask. Well, you went down to a place that was called Ontario Beach Park. And there was a big building, and it said, Life Motion Pictures. Wow, 5 cents. Wow, that sounds good, Life Motion Pictures. You went inside, and there was a company in Chicago called the Motoscope Company. And they had these big reel and all of these little cards, and each card had a little different picture on it. And you turned the crank, and gosh, you saw motion. It was wonderful. Well, that was so much better than just watching stereopticon views, because it actually moved. And that was the very first kind of movement that we had. Now, where Sibley's is today, there was a beautiful, beautiful big building that had several different names, but the last name was called Wonderland. And Wonderland was something of a burlesque hall, something of a vaudeville hall, but they also had the very first motion pictures in Rochester in 1896. Now, what were they like? Well, they were probably not more than 10 or 15 minutes, maybe one reel, and they were silent. There was no sound at all. As a matter of fact, for the first quarter of the century, from that time on until 1927, 1926, there was no sound. But they had other things that provided the sound. And I must tell you a little bit about this. You will all recall that perhaps on East Avenue, there was a Regent Theater. Now, the Regent Theater did something really neat. They went next door to the Sagamore Hotel, and the Sagamore Hotel had an orchestra. And so what they did was to say, okay, you come over in the morning and select orchestral music that goes with the scenes that you're seeing, and in the afternoon you come and play. So you got to see the movies with an orchestra behind it, and that was really, really great, a great time. Other theaters, such as the one that my father had an organ, because not only do you have a piano player, but if you really want to go high style, then you have an organist that comes in and plays the organ. And the organ would be very adept, and if there was a beautiful romantic scene, the sound became very mellow and so on. And then, of course, the horses are charging across the prairie. You'd hear that on the organ, and it was a different kind of experience. I'm sure that people enjoyed. Well, let's take a look now back at some of the early theaters that were here in Rochester. The first one that was of some note was called the Bayou Dream Theater on Main Street about 1904. The Bayou Dream was a beautiful building. The facade had all electrical lights on it, and people enjoyed going to the Bayou Dream for a 15-minute reeler. It was called a one-reeler. And what did you see there? Well, you got to see perhaps a parade, or you got to see a royal wedding, or you got to see a prize fight, or what's even better, a horse race. And it was great. Started at 9 o'clock in the morning, didn't get out until 9 o'clock at night. They had to push your people out because people wanted to see it over and over again because it was such a curiosity to see actually things moving on the screen. Just an amazing kind of form of entertainment. Well, we had others that were there as well. We had one called Fairyland. Another one was called the Happy Hour. I like that one, the Happy Hour. Now, let me tell you about the Happy Hour. You all know about St. Paul Boulevard, St. Paul Street, St. Paul down in Rochester. Well, there was a church there named St. Paul, and that's how it got its name. You probably knew that, probably figured that out, right? But right there is where they turned that church into the Happy Hour. And then later on it became another theater called the Strand, and that was very popular. Same location, though. And that was just to the, I don't know what direction, south, whatever it was, of the Granite Building, on the other side of the Granite Building on that street. Okay, well, what about other theaters? Other theaters grew as interest in films grew. And there was a time when they had all these independent movies were being developed. One of them was called The Clinton. And The Clinton, of course, was on Clinton Avenue. The Clinton Avenue Theater was a very nice one. They had a big ad going on for Uncle Tom's Cabin, and you could see that. Bring the children. But of course, again, there was no sound, but the Clinton was a very popular place to go. And eventually, a gentleman named Mr. Slotnick, Maurice Slotnick, would buy it and change the name to ta-da, the cinema. He changed it into the cinema. And that's how that, yeah, that's that one. It's South Clinton, okay, South Clinton. However, now that my bride has mentioned it, on South Clinton, there was a gentleman, entrepreneur from Detroit, who decided to build the Temple Theater on South Clinton. And it would be approximately today across from where Foreman's was, if I can mention that, okay? It would be across from on South Clinton. And it was a big, beautiful theater. I have pictures of it in my book, of course. And he opened it up mostly for vaudeville. And at the end of maybe 5 or 6 different vaudeville acts, then they would have a 15-minute reeler. And it would be the movie. And that was the format that a good many of the movie theaters in Rochester had. If they were already doing vaudeville, then they would add to it this segment of motion picture films. And people enjoyed it. How much did it cost? 5 cents, 10 cents? That was about it. It was not expensive. And of course, there was this little thing about it. Now you're in a darkened room with this guy over here, you don't know him. so eventually they decided that maybe I'd have ushers to make sure there was no hanky-panky going on in the movies, as a matter of fact. So that was another part of the motion picture industry. Well, what else happened that was fascinating? There were people in Rochester, and his name was George Eastman. I knew it, okay. And he came up with this kind of film that you could wrap around a reel. It was marvelous. And he worked with another gentleman down in New Jersey, Thomas Edison. Thank you. And Thomas Edison had invented a projector and had ordered this film. And he invented something called, no. He invented the little openings.
Sprockets.
Called the sprocket hole, right. He invented the sprocket hole, which was, and so now they got the film down there and they put it in there, and it has to go by your eye about 32 frames every second to give you the apparent motion, a feeling of motion. It's a perception of vision. You're really not seeing something move. What you're seeing is a whole bunch of little frames, individual pictures going by, but each one's a little different. So you think you're seeing motion. Okay, so that worked pretty well, except when it got down there, it tore that stuff to ribbon. And well, how big was the film? Well, Thomas Edison said that. He went between his thumb and forefinger. He says, well, I think that the film should be that big. And that's how we got we got 35 millimeter film. And that was the distance between his thumb and his forefinger. And that was his rule. So then he had to send back to Rochester to get thicker film. 1/500th of an inch, which is not very thick, but that was what it was. And then they could run it through the film gate, and everything worked out very well. Now, there were any number of people, both in Europe as well as in the United States, that had developed projectors. There's the Ideloscope, there's the Latham Ideloscope, there's the Vitascope, there was the Vitaphone, there was the Edison chromatograph. There were all kinds of different film projectors, but the one that they wanted money for was the one that Mr. Edison had invented. And he was a part of a kind of a trust down there in New Jersey, and they weren't going to let anybody else have any movies unless they paid him some royalties. And not only that, but they would send out sometimes some guys to break their projectors, which was not very nice. So the film industry moved from Brooklyn, some of them all the way in New Jersey, out to Cuba. And others decided to go even further away. They went to a place called California. Yes. And that's how it was that the movie industry moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, because they just had to get away from this unpleasantness that Mr. Edison had created, because he just we won't go into Mr. Selden either. That's another story. So now we have these interesting projectors, and in 1914 in Rochester, they were able to take, and of course they also did this at the Temple Theater, they were able to take a very, very famous book, the one by Lew Wallace, the governor of the state of Arizona, and wrote this remarkable book called Ben-Hur. So he would show Ben-Hur, and they would have sound track on a record, which was kind of an interesting kind of thing. Now, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how they changed the records and how you kept track of it if the film was unwinding and so on. There must have been some way that they could keep track of the whole thing. But that was the whole idea, was to have a record that would communicate to the audience what was going on the screen. And Ben-Hur was the biggie film at that theater. Okay. There were some other things that went along with that early motion picture industry. They had something called ballyhoo, right out of Hollywood. You've got to get people to come. Now, how can you get people to come? Well, let's have big, colorful broadsides put up. And they use more adjectives in advertising these films than I can think of when I wrote my book. It's so many adjectives. It was astounding. It was epic. It was a saga of the Old West, whatever it was, and people had to go to see it. Well, some people didn't go to see it. Well, how can we get more people to go? Well, one of the things that we could do is to have little hangers on doorknobs and send kids around to put these hangers on and let them get in the movie for free if they do that. Okay, that was another way. And then a very popular way was something called dish night. Okay, so I happen to have here a piece of Baltic blue dishware. And it says on it, the Riviera, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, December 8th, 9th, and 10th, I live my life with Joan Crawford and Brianna Hearn, and it's in the air with a guy named Jack Benny. And you got one of these. And I mean, who wouldn't go to the movies in the middle of the week to get a nice piece of dishware like this? Now, they were some porcelain dishware, there was crystal dishware and so on, but this is the one that I happen to have. Would you believe I spent $20 on this thing? But the whole thing is, it still had the label on it, which I thought was remarkable. Okay, now there were other ways that they would promote the movies. And one of the ways they did for kids was this thing. What in the heck is this? This is a Dixie cup lid. Now, is there anybody in the audience that remembers Dixie cups? Okay, well, if you got a Dixie cup and you very carefully peeled a little covering off the inside of the lid, there was a movie star. Amazing. And this happened to be Simone Simon. I know you never heard of her. Simone's.
She's in the cat people.
Yeah, oh, okay. So that's what you got. And I thought that was kind of a neat thing too. Try to find one of these today. They're very rare because who saved the lids from that kind of thing? Well, as time would go on, other things would happen in the motion picture industry. And they would do what they did in East Rochester. I happen to have only one ad about from the Rialto Theater in East Rochester, and they had something called Bank Night, and it showed a big $100 worth of bills in their advertising. So hey, maybe you could win at Bank Night. And then they also, of course, had bingo and other things at the movies. Now, what were the movies like when you were kids? Oh, yeah. Is there anybody in here who has never gone to a Saturday matinee? A Saturday matinee. You went to a Saturday matinee? No, you never? Oh, you dear thing. Let me tell you about the Saturday matinee. First of all, you had to be awfully good during that morning, a Saturday morning, and carry out the trash and do all, I wrote in my book, and be good and put your socks away and do all those good things, and then you go into Dad. And you said, gee, you know, Dad, I don't know, I've been awfully good. I took out the ashes, I shoveled the sidewalk, whatever. You think I could get 16 cents? And if I was lucky, I could get a dime, a nickel, and a penny. And now I could go to the movies at the Shine Theater, Temple Theater in Fairport. So we'd been in a big long line outside. I was started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and eventually you finally got in there and you got your little purple ticket, and you tore it in half, and you went inside, and there were these high school kids in there who had these beautiful gray trousers on, and they had the white or the purple striping on the sides, and they took you to your seat. When was the last time you were in a movie when the usher took you to the seat? Well, that would happen. And then you would sit down, and the lights would finally go down, and there was a little hole in the back, and light would come out of that hole, and you would see something that looked like the beginning of a globe going around, and on the top of the globe there was this big antenna, and there was sparks coming out of it. The RKO Palace, right? So you got to see a movie. But before you saw the movie, you might see the coming attractions, which was kind of neat. And then you saw the movie, and it was almost always a shoot 'em up. You always had, sometimes they call them an odor because of the oats the horses ate. Now, as a kid, I never could figure out how it was that the good guys always wore the white hats and the bad guys always wore the black hats, and there was always, the varmints were always stealing, rustling the cattle, and the good guys have to go after them, and they would shoot it out. Now, I remember that Buck Jones and Tom Mix and Hoot Gibson, they had a 6-shooter that shot 12 shots. That was amazing. Oh, it always happened. And always, the bad guys got hit, and the good guy got winged. And the little schoolmarm would come up and say, oh, you dear thing. And then they would go off in the sunset together. Those were great. And then you had cartoons. You saw a cartoon. Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies. That was good. Or it would be Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse. Those were fantastic things. And then, da-da-da-da-da, and you saw this like binocular kind of thing come in here, and there's the eyes and the ears of the world. And it was a newsreel. I saw my first hockey game that way. They didn't play hockey in Fairport. Even on the canal, they didn't play hockey. And so I saw my first hockey game. I thought it was amazing. I tried to find the puck went so fast, I don't know where it was. But I remember that very, very well. And then sometimes there was a second feature. The second feature was never quite as good as the first one, the A movie and the B movie. And of course, when we got home, when the theater finally left, we all had to play cops and robbers. Not cops and robbers, but cowboys and Indians. Out in the backyards and whatever. And we had little cat pistols. We'd shoot their cat pistols off. Oh, I got shot so many times. So that was the effect. But look, it was good, wholesome entertainment. It kept us out of trouble all afternoon on a Saturday. It was great. It was something that I really could enjoy. Now, one of the interesting things next door was the Temple Sweet Shop. And I didn't have any, I only had 16 cents. Sometimes I had 17, 18 cents. But you could buy Walnettos, or you could buy a Guess What. And what was a Guess What? I thought you'd never ask. A Guess What was a little piece of taffy wrapped up. And you wrapped around a little piece of paper that was a puzzle. And you could open it up and you could read the puzzle. And then if you were very careful, you could make that little piece of taffy last through almost half a movie before it all dissolves in your mouth. Well, those are interesting times that I remember. Okay, now, what was going on upstairs? Behind that little screen out there, every once in a while, I would watch the movie, and over there on the side of the film, there would be a little round circle of light. And then there'd be another one. And it was marvelous, because that was when the two projectors were going together, and this reel was ending. So they started that one up with a long leader, so it was already in progress. And as soon as the projectionist saw that little circle, he switched off one machine and turned on the other. And most of the time, you didn't even know it. Now, there was a time, one time, when, for some reason, the film stopped in the film gate. And you could see it go burned, right? A big hole, it's burned right in the middle of the film. Well, it must have taken the projectionist a good 5 minutes to get it fixed. In the meantime, stamping our feet, we were not very polite. But those were some of those interesting times back then. The carbon arcs, of course, were used to provide the light for the film, and it was a special art to be a projectionist. Now, that first film that came out of Rochester was Cellulose Nitrate film that was very, very apt to blaze up. So the inside of a projection booth had metal ceilings, metal walls, and usually a stone foundation or concrete foundation for the floor. Because at first it was very chancy. Then eventually it became cellulose acetate, and that film was the kind of film that didn't burn readily. It wasn't as combustible. So that's another part of the film industry. Now, who ran the films in Rochester? A family from Latvia came here, and their name was Fenivesi. There was Albert and Florence and Paul Fenivesi. And they started the first chain theaters in Rochester. They took the old Cook Opera House and turned it into the Family Theater. What a nice name for a theater, the Family Theater. And then, of course, as you know, you might not know, he will know that it became the Embassy. Well, we don't. The Embassy, you don't know about the Embassy. Well, that's another talk. Okay. At any rate, that was the first one. And then he built the first downtown theater, the big one, downtown, and that was called the Regent. He opened the Regent Theater. Of course, other theaters would be built as well downtown. The one that was the most impressive of all on South Avenue was the one that was called the Rochester. The Rochester Theater would be where Xerox is today, where the Xerox Square is. And that theater was a magnificent theater. Big, beautiful theater, huge, big lobby. It took up the entire block of the other commercial buildings were a part of it. Above the lobby, there was a coffee cafe where you could have coffee upstairs if you knew about that. It was just a great theater, and it had something that other theaters didn't have. It had an air washing machine. Now, if you could wash the air, I don't have no idea, but I think an air washing machine must have been something like the very first kind of air conditioning. Because I remember on the marquee that hung out over the sidewalk were icicles. Well, not real icicles. And it said cooler inside. So on a hot summer day, you wanted to go to the Rochester Theater. Except, eventually by 1929 or 30, somewhere in there, Marcus Lowe bought it. So now it's Lowe's Rochester. And of course, you know it as Lowe's, not just as the Rochester. And of course, Mr. Lowe's did a lot of interesting promotional work, and it became a great place to take your honey to go. There were some other interesting theaters in Rochester that were little neighborhood theaters, like the Pullman Theater and the Rexy Theater. And let's see if we can think of some other ones. Anybody here went to a neighborhood theater in Rochester? The Monroe, yes. What is it?
Paramount Century on Clinton Avenue?
Yeah, we'll get to that. That was one of the biggies downtown. I'm thinking about the Webster Theater on Webster Avenue. There were just so many. There were at least 30 different theaters. And Mr. Fenivesi owned a few of them, but later on, another chain would come in. And that's where my father lost his theater. It was a couple of guys that settled in a place called Gloversville. Now, you may not know where Gloversville is, but there were people. His name was Louis and his brother Shine. And the Shine brothers started there. Louis got out of the Army, helped his brother, and they opened a new theater there, took the old one that was upstairs and remodeled it and brought it downstairs. And it was something like the Astro Hippodrome or something like that. I'm not sure. What is it?
One was the Hippodrome and one was the Glove.
There you go, the Glove and Hippodrome. Thank you. And then he started the next theater in Amsterdam and went on from there to have 150 theaters in 5 different states. Now, at least a dozen of those theaters were Rochester theaters that they'd taken over at one time or another. And one of them happened to be the Temple Theater in Fairport that was built. Now, my father and grandfather said, "Sound? What's sound? That's a fad. There can't be anything to that." And anyway, we spent all this money on this big organ. They can't have sound. Well, they went ahead and built the Temple Theater. And before you knew it, my dad was lucky to sell the organ. And he went into the grocery business after that. But things changed. And of course, the Shine people owned eventually a lot of the different theaters around. They even at one time owned the Riviera, I think, and so on. And their ads, you'd see a long list of what was going on at Shine theaters in Rochester. It was kind of interesting. Now we're going to jump back a little bit, back to time when on 75 West Main Street, there was a theater called the Avon Theater, which eventually became the Phase Theater. And then eventually that would become the Capitol Theater. But when it was the Phase Theater, they had in person Baby Peggy. Now, who was Baby Peggy? Baby Peggy appeared in a movie called Captain January. And Baby Peggy was the cutest little girl you ever saw. She was the darling of the screen. She was the Shirley Temple. Sorry, Shirley. She was the Shirley Temple of her time. And even though this lovely little mop-headed girl right here who could sing Good Ship Lollipop, Baby Peggy did her great work in this movie. And as my wife and I were watching it, this lady named Margaret Montgomery, who is 96 years old, is Baby Peggy. And Robert Osborne is interviewing her. And it was such a marvelous thing to see that happen when this film was shown. Now, later on, Captain January was redone with Shirley Temple. And you might remember that, but I thought that was kind of neat to be able to see that. And of course, I have the ad in here in the book that shows baby Peggy being coming in person to see Faye's Theater in Rochester. Now, there's so much to tell you about, but that was one thing that I didn't want to overlook. I must tell you a little bit about Tom Mix. If I talk to you about Tom Mix, then I got to talk to you about the Eastman Theater. And I cannot overlook that, because George Eastman's dream was two parts. He wanted to bring culture to all you nice people in Rochester, or Penfield. And he decided that not only would he dedicate a part of this music school to his mother, Mrs. Kilbourne, but he also wanted this other big kind of a showcase for the thing that he was manufacturing, film. And so if you look at the early boards that went around the construction site, it said National Pictures of America or something like that. They were going to have the Rochester be the center for all of the film industry. Well, it didn't quite happen, but that was his proposal anyway. Well, now, if you have a theater in Rochester, and he's going to make it the very, very best he can, you've got to have music. So if you have music, you've got to have an orchestra. So he engaged an orchestra. But he's got to have a little more culture than that. So he talked to this gal named Mrs. Enid Botsford. And he gave Mrs. Botsford lots of money. And with lots of money, Mrs. Botsford came up with a studio in which she taught children to do ballet, which I will not do now. And so when you went to see a movie, and let's say you're there at opening night, and it's now 1922, and it's September, I think, and the theater is opening, and you are special people. And so you get there and you see George sitting up in his seat up there and have the orchestra play. And then after the orchestra would play, they would have about maybe 10-minute movie clip of maybe how the building was being built or something. Then the young ladies would come out and they would have the performance. And then you would see The Prisoner of Zenda, which was the first movie to be seen. And I have the original playbills for that. And that was a great, great movie. Then, following that, on the way out, as you left, the organ would play. So that you went out, you'd hear the organ music playing, and it was a great experience. Now, how much did it cost? Well, the best seats in the house cost $1.25. Now, this was back in 1922, so that was not too bad. And Mr. Eastman did something else that I don't want to spend a lot of time on, but he was not happy with Paramount Publics, whose pictures he was running each week, and their rather garish broadsides. So he had the very best artist, Baptiste Madalena, an art student at the Mechanics Institute, do these large, big portraits that were large enough to be put in 6 big bronze frames on the outside of his building. So they were big enough so you could see what was happening as the trolley cars went by. In the book, I have a picture of one of them, I think. Yeah, well, I have more than that. Okay, here's Baptiste Madalena, and these are all done in pastels. Do you recognize that gentleman right there?
Rudolph.
And ta-da, this is my favorite, the next page, or not.
What page have you got?
Pardon?
What page?
Oh, I'm on page 245, to page 46. Oh, here she is. Clara Bow. Here is Clara Bow. And this is the kind of work that he did. It was marvelous. And this is just great. Picture of Clara Bow. And it was all done in pastels. Now, what happened to that collection is another story that we don't have time to go into today. But it was great. That went on until he met his demise. And then Paramount Publics fired the guy and they went back to their old broadsides again. Well, how about some other theaters and other things that are happening in Rochester that were of note? Well, look at my notes and I'll tell you. They're over here. The coming of sound. Okay? Sound was a dream, and they put it on records, but they could never kind of really synchronize it very well, and that just didn't work out. And then there was a gentleman named Lee DeForest. Lee DeForest invented something called the Audion Tube. The Audion Tube allowed us to pick up sound from a little track that was put along the edge of the strip of film. And when it went through the rollers and then past the film gate and then down through where this little exciter lamp would be, the Audion Tube, it would pick up the sound, and it was a marvelous thing. Who had this? The Vitaphone people had it, and it was called Western Electric. 4 brothers with big, long Polish name, like Wyszkowski, whose father brought them to America, decided that they would change their name to Warner. Okay? And they were Warner Brothers. And the Warner Brothers were sharp enough to purchase this new technique. Then they needed to find somebody who was important in the movie, well, in the silent film industry. So they found this gentleman right here. And this, of course, is, who's this guy? Oh, yes, Al Jolson. Had Al Jolson. And they said, gee, you know, Al Jolson would be good. Here's another successful play by Al. Who paid the rent for Mrs. Rip Winkle all the time Rip was asleep? Well, we don't know. But that was right. That was a vaudeville kind of thing with Al Jolson. So they got Mr. Jolson to do his thing and sing the very first they had a movie out in 1926 called Don Juan that didn't go over very well, but eventually they got out. Mr. Jolson came through with his first film, and it was downhill from there ever since. So then eventually every theater, every studio had to have sound, and people became starlets. And one of those starlets that was the first part of the movies was this young lady whose name was Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford was called America's Sweetheart. And let me tell you a little bit about this gal. It says here, from 1914, she got $1,000 a week. In November, she was making $2,000 a week. By 1915, she was making $4,000 a week. She is reputed to be the highest paid woman in the world at the time. 1916, Mutual paid her $1 million a year. Zucker counters with over $1 billion, but for 2 years with a choice of subjects and her own company and studio. 1918, she makes $625,000 for 3 films, First National, plus $50,000 bonus for Charlotte, her agent, and her mother. And then 1919 becomes the co-founder of another movie theater.
United Artists.
Let me shake your hand. That's a 2-pointer if I ever heard it. Yes. Now, do you know who the other 3 principals were in United Artists?
Yes.
Okay. And they, oh, good. Charlie Chaplin.
D.W. Griffith.
D.W. Griffith and Douglas Fairbanks. And now, it seems that Doug and our starlet over here, Mary, kind of hit it off together. And newspapers and so on followed their romance together, and they finally got married, and they built this big, beautiful home called Pick Fair for Pickford and Fairbanks. And they started a theater, and of course, The Mark of Zorro was one of their early films with United Artists films with Douglas Fairbanks and his dueling and so on. It was great. I didn't know I had an aficionado with the audience, but it just goes to show that people are interested in the past and in the kind of films that we had at one time, and those people who made things famous. And certainly Douglas Fairbanks and D.W. Griffith did it. Now, D.W. Griffith made the big movie epics, and he used a couple of gals, one the Gish sisters, Dorothy and Lillian Gish. in the movies, and they were always a big part of his movies. Each of the studios in Hollywood had their own special people, their stars, their starlets, and it was you and I, it was the people who bought the sheet music, people who were interested in all of these things that made them stars. For instance, here's Marion Davies. You ever hear about Marion Davies? She had a boyfriend, William Hearst, right? And you may know about that. But there she is in all her glory in a movie called Peggy My Heart. And so, as a part of publicity, there was sheet music that went along with the movies. There were all kinds of movie magazines and so on. There were young ladies, and I don't know about the guys, but would have whole scrapbooks full of Diana Durbin pictures or people that they enjoyed the most. And of course, that was one of them. Here's another. Here's When My Baby Smiles by Early Berlin. Well, that's just a movie. I mean, that's just a song. But there were other things that happened. Would you believe, in Rochester, New York, the Democrat and Chronicle on the weekend had this for the Rochester public. And what is it? It's the weekly radio and screen magazine from the Democrat and Chronicle. And this says August 18th, 1935. Amazing. And there's, that's right, he's good. Franco Toad is right there. And on the other side, of course, is this blonde bombshell. I don't know if you know who she is.
I've seen that picture before,
I've seen it too.
though. Yeah.
If I could see it, I could tell you. Faye, Alice Faye. There we go, Alice Faye.
She sang.
Right. And this handsome-looking guy down here is a guy named Gary Cooper, and this gal over here is somebody called Jane Long. She didn't last long, but there it is. And so there was great interest in motion pictures at that time in Rochester. Aha. Okay, now we've got this guy. Okay. Quiz. Can you tell us the names of the Marx Brothers?
The real name?
No. Well, yeah, if you know them. I have.
Groucho is Julius.
Yes, that's right.
Harpo was originally Adolf, but when Hitler came along, he changed it to Arthur.
Okay.
Chico was Leonard,
Yep.
and Zeppo was Herbert.
Okay.
There was a Gummel, but he was never in the movies.
Absolutely right. 100%.
Glad to help out.
Well, one of their great films that they had was called A Night at the Opera,
Zeppo's not in that.
and that was a great flick. And then the other one, of course, was A Day at the Races. And so I just had to mention that.
Get duck soup, too.
And duck soup. Wow, I'm impressed. That's great. We were talking a little while ago about about going to see the Saturday matinees and so on. And once you got there, there was this Leonard Sly. Who was Leonard Sly? Does anybody remember Leonard Sly?
Roy Rogers.
That's right, Roy Rogers. Right. But his real name was Leonard Sly. Unbelievable. Well, I don't know what this guy's real name was, but I guess it was Gilbert Rowland. And who was Gilbert Rowland? He was going to be the Cisco Kid.
The
And
original one.
the original one, Beauty and the Bandit. And this guy down here is Pancho.
Yep.
Remember Pancho? Pardon me for talking in your face, senor. You recall that? Cisco meets the outlaw with oomph. She's fast in the draw and faster with her kisses. Whoa. A harmful armful. Gunning for Cisco's hide and his heart. Beauty and the Bandit. Wow. And that was the kind of superbly that followed the movies at the particular time. Well, as I look across here, I begin to see that there's a lot more to the motion picture industry that we've talked about. The Warner Brothers, of course, made their own pictures that were so very important. There was the Columbia Pictures, Paramount Pictures, MGM, whatever. Oh, okay, Lowe's. But we must close by talking about the biggest palace in Rochester, which was, of course,
I wasn't here then.
the Palace Theater on North Clinton. And the Palace Theater was a Keith Elby theater that when he opened that theater up, he had some of his own paintings put in there. And there was beautiful walnut trim, and there was beautiful textured terrazzo on the outside, and there was an outer lobby, and there was an inner lobby, and there was a beautiful staircase, and there was a lovely ladies' lounge area, and a place for the gentlemen to lounge. Everything that you saw there was beautifully carpeted. It was great. Pardon?
Chandeliers.
And the chandeliers were just something else. And upstairs, you would like this. Up there, it got quite dark up there. And it was a great place to take your girlfriends. As a matter of fact, it was very popular. But there were certain movies that were so popular, people would have to wait outside in the outer lobby before they can get to the inner lobby, and then they had to wait for the seats to become available. It was absolutely amazing. Just absolutely amazing. Now, one thing happened in that theater that made it world famous. There was an invention that was called Cinemascope. And the world premiere for Cinemascope happened right there. And the Bauchelin people got an Oscar for their promotion of the film that was used, special film to make that. There was also something called Todd A.O., which was double the size of 35 millimeter. That was 70 millimeter film. And then in your lifetime, you remember Cinerama that happened. And then now it's Dolby Sound. And you go to a movie today, and the whole building can shake with Dolby Sound all over the place. It's a different world, but it is a place to escape. It is a place that is in our hearts. If you have not, I'm not promoting it, but if you've not gone out to Webster, to their lounging theater, you go out there, lay back, and go to sleep while you're watching a movie. It's an amazing experience. And each seat is designated for you. When you go in, they have a little chart, electronic chart that tells where you're going to sit down and whatever. Well, thank you very much for listening. Okay? You want to find out more about it? I just happen to have a book full of all the answers. And thank you. Right.
It's an honor.
Okay.
Question.
Yes, questions, sure.
Charlie Chaplin's movie, The Gold Rush, I think was the first movie I saw. And can either of you tell me where that would have been?
Where did it take place?
Yeah.
It might have taken place in the East Coast, I'm not sure.
You mean where they filmed it?
No, where I would have seen it here.
Oh.
Yeah, that's before I was here. So.
Oh, I can't tell you that either.
I have some memory of going to the Eastman Theater to see a movie, but I think the movies at that point weren't
Right. Well, I can say
young for that.
We're going to talk about Tom Mix for just a minute. Part 2. Tom Mix and Tony, the Wonder Horse, actually appeared in person on the stage of the Eastman Theater. Now, I don't know who took care of Tony, but it was a real coup to have Tom Mix on that stage. Now, one more thing. We didn't talk about the slides and the melodramas and the serials. Serials started at the Piccadilly. The Piccadilly Theater became the Century, which became the Paramount, and Studio 2, all in the same building. In a little community to the south of here called Ithaca, the Wharton brothers had their own film industry. And in that film industry, they had Pearl White as their star. And Lionel Barrymore was the bad guy. And I forgot who the good guy was. Creighton Hale was the good guy. And they made a number of films there. They were also famous for their cliffhangers and these serials. And if you ever remember going to that Saturday matinee, maybe you were able to see Superman, and he's gotten into the Krypton and it's done a thing on him, and you have to go again to see what happened to Superman, whatever. One that was called the Iron Claw, and that was one of the early melodramas. And of course, there was poor Pearl White in The Perils of Pauline that we tied to the railroad tracks. In the last minute, they'd come by and release her, but you didn't know what was going to happen. But all of this happened right in a place called Ithaca. And that was a kind of discovery I made as I looked through the annals of Rochester's movie history. Again, thank you very much. Sit down.
Just let Donovan take over, and he can show you his books, and if you were interested, I'm sure he'd be willing to.
A picture of my girlfriend. Recognize that young lady? Recognize the dog. Judy Garland. Right.